Last week we kicked off this new teaching series called Thrive. It's really based on the regular reality in the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms, but elsewhere, of the people of God looking to God not only for rescue, but also to make them thrive, to have the fullness of life. And over these handful of weeks, we've been just kind of plotted in Psalm 1 and kind of really digging through, because in Psalm 1 we really see the posture that we're called to have in order for God to bless us, in order for God to cause us to thrive. So if you have a copy of the scriptures, you can turn to Psalm 1. If not, no worries, we'll have it on the screen in front of you. Again, though we typically read from the New International Version, simply because it's a little easier to read and understand. In this case, on the screen is going to be what's called the New American Standard Bible Version. And the reason for that is because it's just a little bit more woodenly literal in its translation, and therefore is going to translate some of the words in a helpful way for us to understand the original language a little better in this psalm. So let me read it for you again. Psalm 1. Starting in verse 1. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and in whatever he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so. They are like chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. The word of God for the people of God. Last week we started this series by looking at verse 1 of Psalm 1. And we really looked at the idea of what does it mean to be blessed. The whole psalm starts off, how blessed is the man or woman, would be a fair translation here. And the idea of blessing we talked about, ashareh is the Hebrew word, is this idea of fullness of life. This idea that God has called us, as Jesus says, not to simply have life, but to have life to the fullest. And that experience is necessarily as much now as it is offered in the future. We don't deny a future reality of that. We thank God for that. We long for that truth. But salvation is as much quality as it is quantity of the fullness of life. And so we're saying, how do we be people that simply don't just try to get by, but instead ask God to cause us to thrive, to be people who the psalmist calls blessed. And if you remember last week, the way the psalm starts out is, blessed is the man or woman who does not. And so the first thing we learn is the path away from blessing. And we talked a good deal about the seriousness of what we call sin in the church and the damage that it does to us, and how all too often, especially people who have been people of faith for a long time, tend to devalue or to poo-poo, if you want to use language like that, the reality of sin and the damage that it does to us and to those around us. The psalmist reminds us, sin is equally serious before you come to faith in Jesus as it is after, even though in Jesus it is fully dealt with on the whole. Does it make sense? And so we need to be people who are living in response to that truth. The psalmist very carefully shows us that most people don't get up in the morning and say, I'm going to just be rebellious today, right? Unless you're a 14-year-old boy or something like that. That might be a little different. But instead, the psalmist reminds us there's a path that leads into the descent. There's a path away from blessing. And it starts by listening to the wrong counsel, right? It's not a matter of simply walking amongst people who are far from God, but it's listening to the counsel of this world or the counsel of our flesh that says, I actually have a better way for you to find life. And then we not only listen to it, but then we stand in it. We pause. We think deeply about it. We begin to turn in that direction, and then eventually we sit down in it You remember, yashav, the Hebrew word for sit, also means to dwell, right? We take up residence there. And in all ways, this leads us away from blessing. We paused last week and we were reminded of the huge grace of God, that God didn't look at us sitting fully in the depravity of sin and dismiss us, but instead, in the person of Jesus, entered right into that reality, took our place, and made a path out of it back into blessing. That's what we call the gospel. And I pray that you have received that and it's been transformative in your life. So now we have, in verse 2, this great transition, right? There used to be a song, don't go looking it up if you've never heard it, a rap song about big butts. You ever heard that before, right? People don't bring that up in church all the time, but it's theologically appropriate, and here's why. Because every so often in the scriptures, there is a but that shows up that is so profoundly important that we have to reflect on it, right? So, and I've made you all laugh or shrivel or you're angry at me, and we'll see next week. But you're all going to remember this, aren't you? so job done by communicator. In verse 2, but, right? Blessed is the man or woman who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked or stand in the way of the sinners or sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. A very different reality. Instead of the counsel of the wicked, it's the counsel of God, the law of the Lord. This word delight is a fascinating word. At its core, it really means to desire something deeply. You could translate it delight, but really delight is the experience of getting something you desire. Ever had that feeling in life? You've wanted something so bad, and then you got it, and it's a fulfilling kind of moment. But think about all the things we've desired in this world, and think about how long the delight lasted when we actually got it, right? Think about the things we've longed for, desired, and think about the kind of delight it actually brought to us. What was the staying power of that delight? Did that delight hold you through the most difficult of seasons of life? Did that delight actually cause you to thrive in life? Or was that delight mired in deceit? It promised you something and gave you a taste of it instead of the full thing. That's been my experience. And here the psalmist says, to desire is a good thing, but you must desire the right thing. And if we desire the law of God, that's the thing that leads us to blessing. Now we have to pause. We translate this in English law, but it's really a difficult thing to process, isn't it? Because we have all kinds of modern American and Western and English connotations when it comes to laws, right? And most of us, unless you're like a rigid person who just loves laws and rules and loves following them, let me speak to the rest of you for just a moment. Most of us, when we hear the word law, we're like, well, I don't like that at all, right? I don't want anyone telling me what I can and can't do. And the moment you tell me what I can and can't do, I am predisposed to do exactly the opposite. Isn't that right? So laws almost always, in our mind, I think, we're predisposed to hear that word as restrictive. That's not a fair translation of what's happening here. The Hebrew word is Torah. Right? And I would say to you, we are better off transliterating that word instead of trying to translate it. So I'm saying to you, what if we just struck the word law in your Bible? I'm giving you permission, even if you want, to cross it out and write Torah. Because what the psalmist is thinking about here is something way bigger than a series of laws that have been codified or put together. What he's thinking about actually is a way of living in light of who God is. So when a Jewish person, a faithful Jewish person to this day thinks of Torah, here's what you'll hear them say. Torah is life. Now, we wouldn't necessarily say that. as modern people. Law is life, right? Well, you might. But why? What is it about Torah that is life? Well, faithful Jewish people and those in the days of the Old Testament understood that when you lived life in light of who God was and in dynamic relationship with Him, that's when you had the full experience of life, regardless of the circumstances you were going through. That is, it does not matter the winds and the waves of life. They are still painful and difficult and challenging, but they cannot take away from you the fullness of life if you are living in that kind of dynamic relationship with God. This is what the psalmist is saying. Torah. If we were trying to understand Torah in a very basic way, I suppose we could say Torah at its core is what we would commonly call today the Ten Commandments. You say, but Adam, you just said it's not a list of laws. And I remind you, remember when we went through Exodus not that long ago? We said the Ten Commandments are not a list of laws, right? They're actually a way of living in response to who God is. Because you remember that whole picture, or hopefully you remember that whole picture. The imagery there is of the people of Israel being joined to or marrying God. It's almost like a wedding ceremony where they're coming together in covenant relationship. And then this Ten Commandments, as it were, is a means of how we live in light of the truth that the God of the universe is entering into that kind of intimate relationship with us. At its core, I would suggest to you that the Ten Commandments are actually what I would call maybe a heart evaluator. They're a means by which you can look at them and evaluate the state of your heart. Certainly, there are things that are things that are meant to be followed, but more so, they are things that are meant to help you evaluate your heart. That is, that you can look at any of these 10 commandments or the implications therein and begin to ask yourself a very basic question. What do I want more? This thing or God? Right? What do I want more? My neighbor's wife or God? What do I want more? This thing that I'm going to steal or God? What do I want more? Vengeance that could lead to murder or God? And this is why, if you follow the Ten Commandments all the way from the end back to the beginning, they start off in a very specific way, do they not? You shall have no other gods before me. That is, that you will remain faithful to God and not put your allegiance to any other would-be God in this world. That's the core of what's happening in the Ten Commandments. That's why Torah is a response to God descending to the mountain to be in relationship with us. Same is still true, by the way, for us today because of Jesus. When God descends in Jesus to this world and through the cross and ultimately through his resurrection makes it possible for us to be in dynamic relationship with him, we have in Jesus, the gospel, the greater Torah. Do you see it? And it makes it possible for us to be in relationship with God. So what is the way towards blessing? It's to desire to live God's way. It's to desire Torah. It's to desire the gospel in our New Testament language. So we rightly ask ourselves, okay, but how do we do that? Because it's challenging, isn't it? I mean, if we're just being honest with each other, the situations, the seasons, the challenges of life, let alone the regularities of every single day of living, it's not an easy thing to do to really desire to delight in God's way. And that's where we have to take this concept and think about it even deeper. Right? Because if Torah at its core is just about what it means to live in light of relationship with God, then at the core to desire Torah is actually about desiring God. You see it? And to delight in Torah is actually about delighting in God. That is, if you desire God, you will desire to live his way. If you delight in God, you will delight in living in response to his relationship with you. And this becomes so significant. And this is why the book of Deuteronomy becomes really helpful to us. Right? And some of you are saying, Deuteronomy, oh no, we just did Exodus, so we really have to go there? Yes, we do. Right? Deuteronomy is just a big word that means second law. Deutero, to, nomos, law. Right? So in essence, what happens in Deuteronomy is everything that happened in Exodus gets truncated and Moses repeats it back to the people. Why is this important? Because they're on the precipice of entering this land of promise. The whole journey out of Egypt, slavery, through the wilderness, the challenges of wilderness life, is about to finally lead them to the fullness of life, right? The promised land, the land that's abundant and full of blessing. And Moses says, if you want to stay here, you have to delight in the law. Deuteronomy chapter 6 says it like this. He says, these are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan now to possess. He goes on. So that your children and their children after them may fear the Lord. Right? So there he goes again. Desire the law to desire God. As long as you live by keeping his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, that you may increase, thrive greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord your God, the God of your ancestors, promised you. Let me pause right there and help us understand, in case you're not following the big narrative that's happening here. In the Old Testament, right, especially after slavery happens in Egypt, the whole narrative is about getting to the land, right, and staying in the land. And this is really important because in the land is where God is going to dwell with his people. And this is where life is. But the means of sustaining that life is delighting in this law. Now, fast forward all the way to today. How do we make sense of land and all of these things today? Well, we have to understand it through the lens of Jesus. That's how we're meant to understand these things. So when Jesus uses language like in John 10:10, that I've come to give you life and life to the fullest, he's talking about the land. Do you see it? But in a very new way. It is now spiritually true. Jesus is the land. That's why we're joined to him. It's in Jesus that we're in connection with God. And so, life to the fullest happens here. So whenever you're hearing this imagery in the Old Testament of land flowing with milk and honey, think New Testament fullness of life found only in Jesus. Does it make sense? And so here we go. Verse 4. So he goes, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. See what Moses just did there? He took the whole law and he summarized it in a couple of quick statements. Really significant for us. But what's fascinating to me is the way he summarizes it is all about desiring God. Do you see it? It's the very first thing he says. Listen, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, right? Well, that's about the wholeness of God, but it's also a statement against other would-be gods. If God is the one God, any other supposed God is therefore not God. And this becomes really significant, does it not? Because we constantly, the same with Israel in the land, are being told there are other gods we should follow. We don't use that kind of language. We just call it materialism or consumerism or the American dream or 401ks or whatever it is, the things that are going to give us the fullness of life. These gods that we serve. And by the way, these other gods have Torahs too, small t, ways you're supposed to live in response to them. And they all fail us, church. But God doesn't. He's faithful and he's present. He's the only God. The first declaration that we have to not only be able to verbally agree with, or cognitively agree with, but actually base our life on, is that God is one, right? And that there is no other God. And therefore, Moses goes on and says, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Think about that with me for just a minute. What is the response to the truth of who God is? Love. Now, this is fascinating, isn't it? Moses doesn't say obey. He says love. In the scriptures, love always precedes obedience. It does not mean obedience is unimportant. It means that a foolproof way to manifest obedience is to love. And when we love God, we obey him. Jesus says the same things. If you love me, you'll obey my commandments, right? So obedience flows naturally out of love. God didn't give a law to say, now obey me and I'll prove who I am. He says, you've seen who I am. I delivered you out of Egypt, pulled you out of slavery. So live this way. Be different. You're called into something new. That's what's happening. What does it mean to love God? Moses gives us 3 different ways, right? And he's basically talking about the totality of the human existence. He says, love with all of your heart. That makes sense to us in this language, except in the Old Testament world of Moses, the heart is what we think of today as our mind, right? The heart is the place of intellect. It's the place of thought. It's the place of decision-making, as well as the place of emotions, but the emotions sometimes were a little deeper in the guts, as they would say, especially as it got more into the Greco-Roman world. What would it mean to love God volitionally, cognitively, with your mind? And he goes on and says, love God with your soul. Right? The word soul is the Hebrew word nephesh. At its core, it really means like your invisible life source, the thing that makes you you, the thing that makes you alive. Some commentators would call this like your will and your sensibilities, these things, that the inner you, as it were, ought to love God. And then lastly, he says, with your strength. This is the most fascinating to me because the word translated strength is actually an adverb in Hebrew. It's the word mayod, and literally it's translated almost every other place, very, right? Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your very, right? And so in essence, you have this idea of Moses going, with all of it. I had a Hebrew teacher way back when in seminary who decided we ought to translate this word in this place with all your oomph, right? And if that's fair, I don't know. Strength is fine. It's your physical energy, your effort, all of you put into this reality that loving God is core, it's central to our lives as followers of God. Everything flows out of it. Heart, soul, and strength. When we love and desire God, we are prone to live his way. And when we continue living his way, we cultivate that relationship with God in such a way that we begin to thrive. We have the fullness of life regardless of the circumstances around us. So, you're thinking a good question, I think. Your question is, okay, so if in order to delight in the law, we have to delight in God, question 1 answered. Bigger question, Adam, how on earth do we delight in God? How do we love God? And the psalmist answers the question for us, doesn't he? It's the second part of the psalm. He says, and his delight is in the law of the Lord, and he meditates on it day and night. He meditates on it day and night. You know the word meditate in the original language was often used of like wild animals, like growling and barking and stuff like that. Most often in human connection, it would be translated something like muttering, right? The idea of this is this person who's just walking around talking to themselves constantly. Picture this, right? This person who's walking around telling themselves constantly who God is and what he's done. And when we do that, we grow in our love for God. Does this make sense? Listen, I'm not telling you that you have to leave this place and become incredibly socially awkward because you're just walking around muttering things to yourself about God, although it could be a helpful thing. I am saying to you that the psalmist is rightly calling us to the reality that unless you are intentional about it, it will not happen. Right? The psalmist doesn't say, delight in the law of the Lord and go home hoping that it happens. He doesn't say, cross your fingers and really want it. He doesn't say, if you just do a couple of things here and there, it'll come up naturally. He says, you've got to take a deep dive in Torah to cultivate your love for God. Now, when he's using this word again, Torah, he's talking about it in the fullest sense again. He's not saying go home and memorize Leviticus, right? That could be helpful or very counterproductive, depending upon if you can contextually understand Leviticus. What he's saying is the full aura of Torah. Why does Torah even exist? Because the God of the universe came and rescued us out of slavery in Egypt, right? Remember the Israelites in Egypt, forced to work. Their whole livelihood, their whole identity was wrapped up in what they could do. Their whole value was about what they could offer to the world through their production and their performance. They were chained. They were enslaved to it. Sound familiar? And God comes to them and says, that's not who you are. By the way, that's one of the reasons that Sabbath was a part of Old Testament life and into New Testament life. Not so much as a rule to be followed, but a personal reminder of who you actually are. Your work doesn't define you. God does. It's important. It's significant. And God rescues us, but he doesn't just yank us out of Egypt and then drop us off somewhere and say, good luck, right? He welcomes us into his family. He promises us a land of blessing where not only we will live and thrive, but he'll live with us as our protector and as the one who makes us thrive. When you begin to dwell in this truth, the truth about who God is, not the characterizations of God that the church has made up or that the world puts on him, but the truth of who God actually is, the one who has rescued you from chains and slavery, the one who has rightfully reminded you who you are, the one who has paid the price to buy you back even though you were already his before you ran away from him, and the one who has openly welcomed you back into his house, to his family, to his table where you can be fully blessed. How on earth, as you dwell in that, think about that, ponder that, think about the ramifications of that truth for how you ought to live your life, for who you actually are. If that's my identity, how I ought to order my life. Think about the ways in which that's going to affect your affection for God. Every new season as a parent, I pause and think to myself, man, I've never appreciated my parents enough in my life. You ever thought about that as you've gotten older, right? You had your first kid, and you're like, oh, great, I'm going to be a dad. Oh, man, this is terrible. They don't go to sleep. They expect me to clean up after them for the rest of their lives, right? This is balance of like incredible blessing in life. And then you're like, man, I was so horrible to my parents my whole life. They dealt with all of this stuff, you know? Just a couple of weeks ago, we sent Jack off to college, not that far away, but far enough away. And that Monday mornings we went off, like I broke down, I was weeping. Like both my boys looked at me like, this is weird. We have no means by which to process what's happening here because we don't think we've ever seen you cry in our lives, you know? And I remember this whole thing like, oh, but this is what we're to do, and this is the process of life, and we're sending him off and all these things. And I stopped, and one of my first thoughts was, man, it must have been so hard for my parents to do this. Going through all these experiences of life and reflecting back on my parents, you know what it means? Do you know how profound my love for my parents has grown as my life has gone on? And I continue to see them in the right light as opposed to the light of the laws that they restrict me by? This is what the psalmist is calling us to. Look at who God actually is, what he actually has done for you, and how he actually has set you up to thrive and to live life. And when you fully dwell in that, you can't help but grow profoundly in your affection to him. It's why people who want to learn a language don't just sit at home and study textbooks. They go somewhere and dive right into the culture and are immersed in it, and how quickly they pick up the language. The psalmist says, you want to know Torah? Immerse yourself in it. You want to love God? Immerse yourself in who God actually is. And it will profoundly change you. But you have to be intentional about it. You have to be regular about it. He says day and night for a reason. It's not just an interesting way of being poetic. He's saying with regularity, right? Once a week, not good enough, right? Once a day, not good enough, right? I'm not suggesting to you you need to block out 3-hour sections to do this. I'm saying 15 seconds of reset every so often throughout the day can be incredibly helpful. But you have to be intentional. That's why we talk oftentimes as a church about creating a rhythm of life, not as chains, but as a means of being intentional about these things. God's love for you does not need to grow, but your love for him does need to grow because we have believed lies about who God is. And when we reflect in the truth, it reminds us of who God actually is and grows our affection for him profoundly. Day and night, he mutters the Torah to himself. How do you not fall into the counsel of the wicked? Stand in the way of sinners? Sit in the seat of scoffers? Start muttering, right? I heard a preacher say it this way one time. If you're not talking to yourself, you've got a problem because everyone else is talking to you. Right? We're always taking in, whether we know it or not, how we're supposed to live. You better be reminding yourself of what's true so that you can live in that way. The posture that leads towards blessing is a posture that pursues a dynamic relationship with God. A posture that is intentional in the regular rhythms of life about marinating, saturating itself in that reality. And while we don't talk about Torah in an Old Testament way, we do talk about gospel in light of Jesus. What would it mean for you to regularly, throughout the course of your day and your rhythms of life, set aside moments to mutter to yourself? Right? Out loud or under your breath, in a journal or in your thoughts, to remind yourself of who God is. The profound thing it is that God has done for you and for me in Jesus that we never could have accomplished on our own. And the ways in which God has made it possible for us to thrive in that reality. The path towards blessing is a posture of delighting in, of desiring the law. Can I pray with you? God, I pray for myself and for all my friends here and all my friends, those who will listen to this later on, Lord, I pray that we would never get old of the gospel. that we'd never get tired of hearing it, that we'd be regularly stunned by it anew, that we would create rhythms of muttering it to ourselves. On the mountaintops of life and in the deep, deep, dark valleys of life, the same. God, we believe that you are good. We believe that you have set us on a good path. We know that this world is broken. We know that we are broken. But we do believe that yours is the only way that leads to the full life that we all desperately long for. Forgive us for following wrong counsel. Help us by your Spirit to hear the gospel with regularity, to grow in our love for you, heart, soul, and strength, and to be people who are living in response to it. God, last week we were reminded that before we can pray the prayer of thriving, we have to pray the prayer of rescue. We thank you that you have rescued us from our own Egypts. But we join that prayer and we ask you, Lord, cause us to thrive.